Well, thank you very much. Looks like there's a pretty good crowd on here today, so I'm looking forward to sharing some information about using manure in organic systems. And I also look forward to hearing your comments and thoughts and questions about what challenges you maybe have encountered when considering using manure in your organic cropping system. So I work with producers of all sizes and types. Like Tyler mentioned in the introduction, my focus is primarily on helping the livestock sector manage manure according to nutrient management plans and just ensuring a compatibility of their system with natural resources in the environment. But over the past probably 10 or 15 years, there's really been a shift personally in my program to more of promoting the use of manure in cropping systems, primarily because we don't see as many integrated livestock and cropping systems as we used to. And so while we still have plenty of livestock production in various parts of Nebraska and throughout the country, those systems may not necessarily be tied to large cropping systems. And vice versa with our cropping systems, traditional conventional producers rely quite heavily on inorganic fertilizers, which are much more available to the plant, but also much more mobile in the environment. And so manure is really a resource for those producers to build their soil quality, improve nutrient recycling, and just improve the overall resilience of that cropland. So today I'm going to kind of go over a number of topics, and visiting with Margaret Smith and others, I think there's a lot of a variety of questions about, where do you get manure? How do you use it? What do I need to test for? What are the steps to deciding how much manure to apply in a cropping system? And so I'm going to try to hit on all of those. And if there's questions or a need for greater details, then certainly we'll engage in some conversation based on your questions. But I want to talk about just kind of the basic considerations for using manure in organic cropping systems, the benefits of manure to soil resilience and sustainability of cropland, nutrient stewardship, which is when we think about permitted animal feeding operations or any farming system that has a CNMP, or a comprehensive nutrient management plan through the NRCS. Those are the systems that are really focused or have to be focused on their nutrient stewardship based on regulatory considerations. And so we'll talk briefly about nutrient stewardship, some of the logistics of using manure on cropland, how do you get access to manure, and then I threw in a couple slides just about soil carbon amendments. Manure is a soil carbon amendment of sorts, but not all manure has a high carbon content, and there are other carbon sources that can be used to add carbon to soil. So just thinking about the rules and regulations around using manure in our organic cropping systems, it can be applied as a raw manure, which just means it hasn't been treated. It maybe had been dried, but it really hasn't been treated in any way to change consistency or microbial contaminants or content of that manure. And composting, of course, is kind of the ideal process for creating a product out of manure that is stable and easy to transport, less costly to transport because it's got a lower moisture content than raw manure. But either that compost or a good quality manure with bedding material in it, like a bedded pack barn for beef cattle or other small ruminants, or swine, has a good carbon contribution as well. So we know that if it's applied correctly, according to a nutrient management plan and according to best management practices, manure is good for soil health. It's good for improving water quality because it improves nutrient cycling in the soil. It reduces runoff and erosion, does a number of things to prevent or reduce the potential for nitrate leaching. And so it's often gotten a bad rap over the years, mainly because people tend to associate it with spills or discharges from operations, which are fairly uncommon, but certainly when you have a situation like that, it tends to maybe dampen the enthusiasm for using manure in a system. So there's some pretty specific guidelines about using manure or manure-based compost in organic systems. One of the things that to me is a little bit ambiguous is they say that raw manure must not contaminate soil, water, or crops with pathogens, excess nutrients, etc. They don't really define contaminate or what that means in a permitted animal feeding operation. So we're talking about facilities that have livestock that are operating under a permit from the state or from the EPA. There's very specific practices in place to limit runoff or losses of manure nutrients from the production area. We don't see that once manure has been transferred from one of those operations to a cropping system. So for instance, in a permitted livestock operation, if they're applying the manure on that farm, they have strict setback requirements. So you can't be closer than 35 feet from a water body source or 100 feet from a private well. So there are setbacks and application practices in place to prevent that loss of contaminants. And so in a system that's not governed by those animal feeding operation regulations, there's still good practices that we should be using, but those aren't really defined for organic systems or other types of cropping systems. So we can certainly talk about what some of those practices might be, but for here, they mentioned, it shouldn't be applied on frozen ground. We would also say not to apply to saturated soil that can't take in that manure. And we have, like I said, setbacks and other limitations on the concentration of nutrients that can be applied. So the other thing to consider is that if you are growing a crop that is intended for human consumption, then there's more limitations on using manure. So raw manure is not allowed, or it needs to be incorporated into the soil, and there needs to be a period between when that's applied and when that crop is actually harvested. That doesn't apply to crops that are raised for animal feed, though. So raw manure is definitely still an option for those systems. Like I mentioned, composting of manure is sort of the ideal treatment before it goes into an organic system, particularly if that system is producing food for human consumption. The problem is it's pretty hard to find compost that's been composted correctly. So there are a lot of livestock systems that might stockpile manure, turn it a couple times, but not necessarily reach those temperature standards that are required under the organic regulations. So we'll talk just a little bit more about composting and what that does to the manure, but something to consider if you are wanting to access composted manure is really understanding that system has been operated correctly to meet those composting standards. So any production practices that support soil health is going to benefit our natural resources. Like I've mentioned, there's improved nutrient cycling. When the soil is healthy, we see water quality and quantity improvements as we increase water holding capacity, reduce risk for runoff and erosion, reduce nitrogen leaching potential. And so any type of practice that improves our soil health is beneficial to the environment. And in organic systems, and as you know, typically there's lower yields in those systems because of the limitations for using pesticides and herbicides and things of that nature. But one thing we do know is that when there's extreme weather events, so drought, flooding, other weather events that would generally tend to disrupt a crop production system, systems with healthier soils are more resilient to those changes in those extreme weather events. So organic systems that have really focused on building their soil quality tend to be more resilient to those extreme weather situations than conventional systems that have not necessarily been using good practices for soil health. So we think about what manure has to offer. Organic matter, depending on the type of manure, some are going to be quite low in organic matter, others would be much higher. All manure contains nutrients. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the big ones, but there's also micronutrients. And again, it really depends on the source of manure and the type of livestock it came from and how it was handled. And then, of course, microorganisms, and that combination of microorganisms and organic matter is beneficial to the soil because as organic matter is broken down by microorganisms in the soil, organic nutrients that are tied up in that carbon material are released and made available to plants. So manure has a lot to offer to soil, but of course there are challenges as well, and we will get into those. So like I mentioned, not all manure is created equal. Particularly in Nebraska, I typically think about beef manure versus swine manure versus poultry. Those are kind of our more common livestock species here. Those systems can be feedlot for beef cattle, so it's fairly dry manure, a lot of inorganic material mixed into it because of that soil surface on the feedlot. If you look at poultry, particularly broiler production, those birds are on a litter base or a sawdust or wood chip base, and so higher organic content in that manure. It's a much drier material and it tends to retain more of the nitrogen, so it has a higher nitrogen to phosphorus ratio than you would see in a liquid manure, where a lot of nitrogen is being lost through ammonia volatilization. And so aside from the animal producing it and what they're being fed, the way that manure is stored, and then finally the way it is land applied really can impact the availability of nutrients from that manure. So you see on the left here, liquid manure being applied to the surface versus in the middle, an injector system that applies that manure below the soil surface. So that injector system is going to help retain more of the nitrogen that's applied, since it's putting that liquid below the surface of the soil. So let's talk just a bit about the 4 R's of nutrient stewardship. And these come out of the Fertilizer Institute. So these aren't just for manure. We've probably applied these principles to manure for much longer than we've really focused on them for inorganic fertilizers, simply because these stewardship practices have been required for permitted animal feeding operations for 30 plus years, probably going on 40 or 50 years now. So anyway, what we typically talk about is we want to make sure that we are using the right source at the right rate, at the right time, and in the right place. whether that's with manure or an inorganic or other organic fertilizer. The right source means we want to match our fertilizer to the type that the crop needs. So for instance, if we have low phosphorus concentrations in our soil and we're trying to build soil phosphorus, we would probably look for using a manure like beef manure or poultry litter that has a higher phosphorus content. If we're limited on phosphorus because we have high phosphate in our soils, then we might be looking to stay away from manure products that have a high phosphorus content or high organic material content. With the right rate, we want to match what we apply to what our crops need. Anything that we put on in excess of what the crops need is really of no value. So if we're in traditional systems or conventional cropping systems, we often see nitrogen maybe not being accounted for in the irrigation water and in the fertilizer and credited from a previous legume crop, et cetera. So we really try to focus on, let's not put more nitrogen into that system than it needs, because that nitrogen won't hang around forever. And we don't want to see nitrogen leaching out of that soil profile because the crops didn't use it. The same could be said for phosphorus. Phosphorus moves with soil particles, so it tends to bind to the soil particles. It doesn't leach. But if your field is prone to erosion, then you're more prone to losing phosphorus from the surface of that field if you're not using other best practices to keep the soil in place. The right time means we want to put that nutrient on when the crop is going to use it so that we don't lose it. We'll talk a little bit about timing of manure application relative to different crop growing seasons in the Midwest. But generally we'd like to see farmers get away from winter manure application, but we also realize there's a big risk waiting till spring and hoping that you'll have time to get into the field with manure prior to planting. So fall application of manure is still very common, and we try to match that application as closely as we can with when the crop needs it. And then the right place. We want to keep those nutrients where the crop can use them. So again, just making sure that we are applying them ahead of a crop, or if we're able to side dress during a cropping season, that's great as well. But we just want to make sure that we're really matching our fertilization to what the crop needs and not using those manure or fertilizer products just to get rid of them. So again, regulations have done a lot to limit that among permitted livestock operations, but not nearly as much among crop systems that are not under the ownership of a animal feeding operation system. So one of the first things that we would see farmers do if they are operating under a nutrient management plan or a comprehensive nutrient management plan, and again, these are specific plans required if you are a permitted animal feeding operation or you are receiving cost share from NRCS, say EQIP or other programs, and there's a requirement to have a comprehensive nutrient management plan. Personally, I think everybody should have one if you're growing crops, because it's really a way to manage your nutrients to meet the crop needs without over applying. So organic systems, am not as familiar with those, but my understanding is there's maybe not a tendency across the board for farmers to be doing soil sampling, whereas in permitted systems, soil sampling is required, and it goes into a 5-year nutrient management plan where you're actually tracking nutrient concentrations over time. So I just wanted to share some different soil sampling methods if this is something that's new to you. It is fairly labor intensive and time intensive. Most most operations that are operating under a nutrient management plan or a comprehensive nutrient management plan are probably paying someone, an agronomist, to come out and do their soil sampling for them. But if you look here, we have a field that we've kind of divided up 3 different ways. The first is cell sampling, where we kind of make a grid on that field, and then each square of that grid we want to be about 1.5 to 3 acres in size. So depending on the size of your field, that will dictate how many cells you have there. And then the X's shown in the square below that cell sampling diagram are the samples you would take. So you're going around that cell with a soil probe, taking samples at different depths, combining them, and then submitting each of those as one sample that represents that section of your field. Point sampling is very similar, except you lay out a series of points, and then you're doing representative sampling 15 to 30 feet out from around that point. So again, you're sampling the field in small sections, because we, one sample for a 50, 100, 200 acre field is not going to accurately reflect the variation in nutrient availability and nutrient content across that field. The third one is zone sampling, which tends to be for smaller fields where you maybe have low spots, high spots, you've had maybe a former feed lot was in that system, or some other livestock production there where you might have concentrated nutrients in a particular area. That's where a field like this might benefit from zone sampling. So you kind of select the different zones of the field based on topography and other characteristics, and then you sample within those zones, and you can customize your nutrient management to each individual zone. So what do we want to test soils for? Typically, most labs will have what they call a standard soil analysis. It'll be a package, and it'll have, this is a representative list of characteristics that you might get back from a soil sample that you send into a lab. So your pH and your cation exchange capacity, your nutrients, organic matter, micronutrients as well, and probably $25 to $35 for a sample to be analyzed. And if you think about zone sampling, where you've got 3 zones, you're going to be sending in at least 3 samples, maybe multiple depths of samples. So if you've got a grid analysis, now you're talking about quite a few more samples that are going to be sent in. So $25 to $35 a piece. But you probably can get away with maybe doing this soil sampling every 3 to 5 years based on what the soil's characteristics are now and what goals you have for increasing nutrient concentrations or pH or organic matter concentration in those soils. So once we know what is in our soil, as far as nutrients, then we need to think about what nutrients does our crop need. We're going to make our decision on nutrient management based on, I'm growing crop A, I expect it to have this yield. It should take up this much nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium from the soil. Here's what I have in the soil already available. And the difference in those two is what we need to add in the form of a fertilizer. So every state pretty well will have their own recommendation for estimating crop nutrient needs. So I've put in down here at the bottom kind of a legume nitrogen credit from soybeans, alfalfa, other crops. It might be different in your state. You'll probably have a state-specific formula or equation for calculating nitrogen application or nitrogen needs for crop. But in general, we're going to base that upon the type of crop, what we expect for a yield, our average nitrate nitrogen concentration in the root zone, the organic matter concentration in that soil, and then any nitrogen credits. So previous manure application, irrigation water that has nitrates in it already, and credits from previous legume crops. So then, like I said, that calculation will be based on what do we have in the manure? What do we need to apply to that crop? How are we going to apply it? What's our method? And then we'll need to consider the nutrient availability factors in manure. So what does that mean? Nutrient availability primarily applies to nitrogen. So if you have a liquid, let's say a liquid swine manure slurry, there's organic nitrogen and there's inorganic nitrogen in that. So when you apply that to the soil, the inorganic form, or the ammonia and ammonium forms, those are readily available to plants. The organic nitrogen that's in there is going to become available over the next 2-3 growing seasons as the organisms in the soil break down the organic matter and convert that organic nutrient to a plant available form. So that adds another level of complication with manure of trying to really understand, based on a soil sample, what can I expect to get this year in terms of nitrogen from that manure, and then what can I expect to become available next year and the year after that. As far as the manure nutrient concentrations, if you are getting manure from an operation nearby, you're probably going to get a sample of that manure, hopefully that's been taken right before that manure was transported to your farm. That's one thing to be sure that you ask a farmer if you're purchasing or getting manure from them is, when did you do the manure analysis and how did you collect that sample? Because the data that you get in that analysis report is really only as good as the sampling technique used and the time since that sample was taken. So you can still have changes over time in that manure as it sits. When you go to apply the manure, then it's a good idea to also sample during that application, just to double check that you're applying the rate you think you are, particularly with nitrogen. If we are expecting to get 20 or 50 pounds of nitrogen per ton of manure, and we don't get that, then we need to know that there's probably a nitrogen deficiency that we need to meet in some other way if we can. So the planning versus the actual application, obviously we have to apply based on what we have as a sample before applying, but then we want to double check that by collecting samples during that application to confirm our actual rate of nutrient application. So what manure analyses do you need? Again, this is a package here. What I've listed is all of these different nutrient and chemical properties. Labs, again, will typically have a manure / compost standard testing package. You don't necessarily need to get that full suite of data. But at the very least, you would want to know, at the very least, you'll want to know your total nitrogen, ammonia, nitrogen, nitrate, the different forms of nitrogen that are in that, and your phosphorus and potassium. And beyond that, carbon nitrogen ratio and your micronutrients, if those are something that you're trying to manage closely, then certainly go ahead and have those analyses done as well. And so these samples probably looking $45 to $50, depending on your lab. So once we know what we have available in the soil, we know what our crop needs, we know what's in the manure. This is where the point where we need to figure out how much of that nitrogen is actually available in that first year after the manure is applied. And so when we mentioned earlier about nitrogen being, some is in an organic form, some is organic within a manure, the nitrogen associated with the urine fraction of manure is going to be ammonium nitrogen. And so if we put that on the soil surface, the majority will be lost within a day or two to volatilization. So if you see over here on the left-hand side, if it's injected, we would expect to get 95% of that nitrogen available the first year. So we're putting it under the soil surface. It's not getting volatilized. We're getting the full value out of that nitrogen, the ammonia nitrogen fraction. But if we apply it to the soil surface or we incorporate after several days, the majority of that nitrogen by that point, the inorganic nitrogen is lost. So then we're left with the organic fraction, which is on the right-hand side of this table. And these availability factors, again, are going to be specific to your state. Each state probably has their own data where they've estimated these availability factors, and they are just that, they're estimates. So for instance, with solid slurry liquid manures, biosolids, compost, we would say that in the first year, you could probably expect about 40% of the nitrogen, the organic nitrogen that you applied, will be available to your crops that first year. Then in subsequent years, that's, a little bit more is going to become available each year. But this is a good reason for soil testing, is to really understand, am I applying what I think I applied? And am I seeing it become available in the way that the data suggests that it should? So again, this is from an extension publication out of Nebraska, but I would encourage you to seek out your state's recommendations if you're going to be using manure. So here's just some typical nutrient concentrations in different types of manure. Again, when we talk about these typical concentrations, they are very much based on, or they vary based on where that operation is located, what's the climate, what's the nutritional inputs for those animals. But in general, we would look at beef cattle manure. It's usually applied on a ton basis, so 10 tons per acre, 20 tons per acre. And so the nutrients in there, we would say probably about 20 pounds of organic nitrogen per ton. So that is the nitrogen that would become available over time as the ammonium nitrogen, pretty darn low. Feedlot manure tends to sit outside and lose a lot of that nitrogen. So we'd see, a couple pounds per ton. So you're not likely to apply beef manure to meet nitrogen needs of a crop, because you're going to need a whole lot of it, and you're going to over apply a lot of other nutrients. Broiler chickens, like I said, broiler litter is pretty good quality. If you've used it, you probably know it's good quality because you've paid a lot more for it than you would for some of these other types of manure. High in organic nitrogen, 60 pounds per ton, still quite a bit of ammonium nitrogen available for that crop in the very first year, and fairly good balance between nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So then the swine finisher and the dairy cows, both of those would be liquid systems. For this data, we're talking a slurry type system where that manure is not diluted a whole lot. If their swine or dairy operation is storing manure in a lagoon, then these numbers are going to be quite a bit different from that. So let's think about how well we can match manure application with crop needs and growing season. Most crops are, growing May through September or October, which is why we typically see manure application taking place in the fall, once crops have been harvested, and after that soil has cooled sufficiently. And when we say sufficiently, the colder that soil is, the less microbial activity that's taking place, and the less opportunity there is for any of the nitrogen compounds in that to be mineralized and released and potentially lost through leaching. So soil temperature is very important. And there's usually that window of the soil temperature's gotten down low enough, and we haven't gotten snow or we don't see freezing soil. So that's our window to apply manure in the fall. And the idea is that come spring, when those soils warm up and you're getting ready to plant, that those nutrients are going to be starting to become available because the microorganisms in the soil are becoming active and beginning to break down those nutrients. In the wintertime, particularly
Hey,
this
Amy?
year. I'm sorry.
You're controlling your slides, correct?
Yes.
Can you, it seems like they have like advanced on their own. Can you double check that for us, please? We're looking at some.
I'm seeing compatibility of manure with different crops. Is that what?
No, we're seeing mites and stuff like that right now.
Okay. Let me stop share and.
Yeah, try this current. Try it out in there.
It shows that I'm not sharing. So is it? Have you loaded the presentation from that end?
I'm not.
No, none of us.
We aren't sharing. I don't know what's going on here.
Okay, on my end, I'm having to share it again. So let me.
Yeah, you are.
There you are.
That looks right.
Okay.
Oh, technology is great when it works, right?
Yeah. So you should have told me a long time ago. I was totally confusing you about talking about a subject that was not showing up on the screen.
Yeah. It was kind of not bad, and all of a sudden it just advanced like 13 slides or something like that. Like it just did really quick, and it was like, so all right. Yeah, now we're on track.
Okay. So again, we're looking at trying to fit that manure application in between when crops are harvested in the fall before we get a hard freeze of our soil or we get snow on the ground. And ideally, it'd be great to put those manure nutrients on in the spring, a month before we plant, or a month after we've planted a crop. But typically, there's challenges with soil moisture, soil still being covered with snow, waiting for that soil to heat up to plant, and it's just tends to be a challenge. So composted manure, like I mentioned, one of the very first slides, if you're growing a crop that is for human consumption, that manure would need to be composted prior to using it. There's a lot of benefits to composting manure. One of the big ones is there's much less odor in a composted manure than in a fresh or raw manure. If you are in an area where neighbors are not accustomed to smelling animal manure, then that might be a pretty good incentive for you not to apply manure in that area. You might tend to get some complaints about that odor, although that period that odor is really an issue is fairly short. A few days within a manure application is not going to last throughout the growing season. So when we compost, if it's done correctly and we reach the temperatures in the pile that are recommended, weed seeds tend to be eliminated or reduced quite a bit. So in an organic system where you are really concerned about weed management, a raw manure may not be a great choice in that system because it could have weed seeds in it, depending on the diet that was fed to those animals. Composting also reduces pathogenic organisms. That's the main reason that composted manure can be used on organic crops that are produced for human consumption. One thing I would say is that pathogenic organisms are not just in the manure, they're in the soil as well. So you're not eliminating pathogens from a system by using an organic source, but you are reducing the risk of actually spraying or applying pathogenic material to the tissue of that plant that you're growing. I would say I do have people ask me often if they can use fresh cattle manure or fresh horse manure in a garden. I do it. I don't really have, I never compost anything that I use for my garden because I typically have access to different types of manure that we're testing in our lab or that we've used for some sort of project. And I take that home and I put it on my garden a month before I plant it. So I guess my point being that there's pathogens in the environment without manure being added to it. So that's just something to consider, particularly if you're using it in a home garden. I tell folks, wash your vegetables before you eat them. That's probably the biggest concern there. If your kids are going out and picking tomatoes and onions and eating them, you might want to be a little bit more careful about what you put down as a fertilizer source there. So in composted manure, there's probably not going to be any available nitrogen in the inorganic form or ammonia form. So any nitrogen that you get out of that is going to become available over that growing season as that organic material is broken down by organisms in the soil. And you'll probably only get about 15% of the nitrogen that's in that compost being available in that first year. So compost is not a super great source for nitrogen, particularly if you are wanting it as a pre-plant or kind of an early season nitrogen source for a crop. Phosphorus doesn't really go anywhere. It's associated with the manure solids and the carbon material that's used to facilitate that composting process. And so you're not going to lose phosphorus during composting. You will change some of the form. Typically, 30% of the phosphorus in a composted manure is going to be available the first year, the rest being available the next year. The good thing is if phosphorus doesn't leach, so as long as you're controlling erosion, you're not losing that phosphorus from the soil surface, and phosphorus can actually be built up in the soil over time. So your soil has some capacity to deal with excess phosphorus that's land applied if you put on a lot of compost for the organic matter and for the nitrogen. Depending on your site, you can probably build that soil phosphorus over time without increasing your risk of losing phosphorus to erosion. Potassium then, about 30% available in year one. And again, probably not going to be a real significant source of potassium, but it again depends on the source of that compost and what your nutrient source was before the composting process. So like I said, the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus is kind of flipped to where you're probably not going to apply a composted material on a nitrogen basis because you will significantly over apply phosphorus. My recommendation would be to run a p-index analysis on fields that are receiving compost, and I would probably do that on fields receiving any type of solid manure, so a poultry litter or a feedlot manure, whether those are raw or composted. Phosphorus index is a tool. Again, most states have their own index and how they calculate it, but it essentially is rating the risk of phosphorus loss from a field based on phosphorus content in the soil, topography of that system, whether it's steep slopes or not, what the precipitation amounts are in that area. So it's taking all of these things into account to say you're at a high risk for losing phosphorus from this field, or you have a low risk, and then that would dictate how manure or nutrients are applied, whether they're applied on a nitrogen basis or on a phosphorus removal rate. So how do we get access to manure? I mentioned before livestock producers, whether those are permitted animal feeding operations or smaller operations that are not having to operate under a permit. If you are aware of them in your county or nearby, reaching out to those farmers to see if they have excess manure that they're willing to sell is one way to go about it. You can also reach out to commodity organizations in your state, so pork producers or the Cattlemen Association. They will likely know of smaller operations that are not showing up in the regulatory database because they aren't required to have permits. NRCS is another source that works with smaller operations on conservation practices, so they may be aware of manure sources that that you're not aware of in the area. A lot of states now are getting to where they have manure brokers. These are typically consultants who work with large animal feeding operations to help manage their environmental records, and they are kind of the middleman for moving manure from those animal feeding operations to cropland where it can be used. So if you do a Google search in your state for manure consultants or manure brokers, you might find folks like that. There's also custom manure applicators in every state. Those organizations will know where, or those individuals will know where they're getting manure from every year, and could be a good source to talk to that livestock farmer to find out if they're looking for additional land to utilize nutrients. Co-ops would be another option. And then I threw in here this idea of diversifying your operation by adding livestock. I never really, when I started my career, I never thought I would see people building livestock systems just to have the manure for their cropping system, but that is very much what we've seen in the last couple decades. It's a way of sort of diversifying that operation and diversifying your risk. You now have two commodities instead of one. So you might, in a year that your crops aren't producing, you still have revenue from the livestock. I'm not going to go into that in great detail. Your state, your commodity groups in your states would be able to tell you a little bit more about opportunities for adding a livestock system to an operation. But there's typically an integrator and a grower relationship where you're the grower and you are assuming some of the risk, and the integrator is assuming some of the risk as well. And either you are paid based on performance of the animals, or they're renting space, or however that particular integrator runs things. The thing to keep in mind, for instance, with a 2,400 head swine finisher facility, you're probably going to get enough manure out of that to fertilize a few hundred acres on a farm. For a 1,000 head finishing operation, a little over 100 acres of corn can be fertilized. So that gives you an idea of a way to maybe match livestock production with a cropping system and the nutrient needs. So just some basic summary statements about being mindful of manure. I call these following your manure manners, or minding your manure manners. Whether you are required to do these things because you operate under a permit or not, they're good ideas to keep in mind. So knowing what your soil needs, or what your crop needs, is one of the key factors to using manure wisely. There's no reason to put nutrients on that you don't need, because you really don't get any value out of them if they're not improving your crop production. Typically, we would apply manure on a nitrogen basis, so we're trying to meet the nitrogen needs of the crop. Depending on the type of manure, this could over-apply phosphorus, but if your soils aren't high in phosphorus, or your phosphorus index for that field isn't high, there's that opportunity to build phosphorus over time, and so we don't necessarily need to limit phosphorus application until we get to a situation where that phosphorus is fairly high concentration in the soil. There can be some pH impacts from manure depending on, again, the type of manure, the source, the diet of those animals. So pH is an important metric to get on a manure analysis. And then again, raw manure, it's less expensive, probably more readily available, but it has some drawbacks. We can get weed seeds. We're hauling a lot of water, so it might be lower nutrient concentration, higher cost to get it to the field and applied. So there's drawbacks and there's benefits, and those just need to be kind of weighed to decide if manure is right for your system. The last thing I wanted to mention, This is a relatively new conservation practice standard from the NRCS. I think it came out 2 years ago. Maybe it's more than that now. But anyway, there's a soil carbon amendment practice where their NRCS is paying through the EQIP program to see organic matter added to soil. And so manure is one of the ways that that can be added. Another one that our group has done research on here in Nebraska is using wood chips. And so this final slide, I'm just showing some of our data where we looked at organisms in the soil that we know contribute to soil processes that are positive. So for instance, mites in soil contribute to nutrient cycling and soil formation, pest control. So we want to see mites in the soil. Columbella are one of the organisms that impact soil macroaggregation, so they help soil particles stick together and be less prone to erosion. Whereas Symphyla are ones that we don't want to have in the soil. They feed on the plant roots. They can be a major pest. And so a lot of our work in the last few years has looked at how different manure types and different carbon sources impact these arthropod populations in the soil. And using swine slurry versus swine slurry and wood chips and comparing that to just control, which is inorganic system, we saw a positive, significantly greater abundance of mites in the treatments that were receiving swine manure with or without wood chips. We saw a good response in the Columbella, again, from using swine manure with or without wood chips. And we saw these bad pests or less desirable organisms reduce in abundance when we were using those organic sources of carbon and nutrients. So just threw that one in as it's kind of a good picture to talks about what goes on beneath the soil that we don't necessarily see, but it really impacts the quality of our production system quite a bit. So I'm going to end with that, and looks like we have 5 or 6 minutes for questions. So I'm happy to hear your questions or your comments if you have experience using manure and organic system that you want to share with the group. Be happy to hear that as well.
All right, sounds good. And I have to do a shout out. I like that little picture you have there, the manure lady. That's kind of cool.
Thank you. When people call you that, you just as well accept it and embrace it. So. Yep.
So we got some questions here. So is there like an upper limit to the nitrogen and to yield when you apply, like, for example, 4 pounds of nitrogen on that? Do you know that, or?
So what I would say is if you are putting on more nitrogen than your crop needs, you are going to lose that nitrogen to the environment. It doesn't stay, it's not going to stay put in the soil the way phosphorus does. So that's why we really try to encourage crop farmers to understand what they have available in the soil, account for any nitrogen that is present in irrigation water. Don't over apply nitrogen. You can see small yield boosts with the addition of more nitrogen throughout the growing season, but there comes a point where the cost of applying and putting that nitrogen into the system doesn't return the revenue that you get from that yield increase. So you can it kind of bothers me that there's no real regulation on nitrogen use in cropping systems. We're very particular about how that's used in an animal feeding operation that is also growing crops, because they have to have a very detailed records of their nutrient management, where that's applied, how much they put on, what was their actual crop yield, whereas we don't have that requirement for inorganic fertilizer or for any fertilizer applied in a system that's not under that animal feeding operation permit. So I would say the drawback is you're spending more money than you're getting value back out of if you're over applying nitrogen, and you're probably contributing pretty significantly to nitrate leaching and groundwater quality impairment if you're using more nitrogen than your crop really needs.
All right there. Thank you. Another question here from Tom. He visited Standard Process, a family-owned company operating in southeast Wisconsin. They've been there for 95 years. They have a process using their only plant waste to make their own fertilizer due to the limitations of injecting animal waste on their land. Are you aware of these practices?
I'm not aware of that specifically. Any plant material is going to have some nitrogen content to it as well. You know, a lot of people will use grass clippings on their garden because there's nitrogen in those grass clippings. And it's mostly going to be in organic form, so it's going to be released as that material breaks down in the soil. So that is, you know, that's a benefit there of using an organic-based nitrogen product like that. So I don't know about that particular system or that company, but it sounds like they've got a good approach to supplying nitrogen in a stable form.
All right, good. And then another one. It's kind of, how likely am I introducing weeds into my fields by spreading non-composed turkey litter from a neighbor's turkey barn? And can I check or test that litter before it's spread?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would probably ask that neighbor where they get the bedding material and the feed ingredients. One of the biggest concerns that we see right now is herbicide-resistant Palmer amaranth seed, and we see that being introduced through feed, cotton hulls and other feed ingredients coming from down south, where that plant is more prevalent. And I know that in beef operations, that's a concern. And for a while, we were getting a lot of those feed ingredients for beef cattle in that form. And so we've had a lot of farmers around here in Nebraska that are very cautious about using beef manure because there's that opportunity to introduce Palmer amaranth to their fields. I'm not as familiar with turkey litter because we don't have much of a turkey production system here in Nebraska, but I would talk to that neighbor about, where do you get your feed ingredients from? And probably the best way to test it would be to get some of that litter and grow it in a pot of soil and see what grows out of there. Don't plant anything in it, but mix it in with the soil, water it, see what grows out of that's maybe still in there and hasn't been degraded as it went through the digestive system of the animal, or if it's part of the litter in the system that hasn't been treated in any way.
All right, thank you. We got a lot of questions coming in. Unfortunately, we're not going to probably get to them all. We'll probably just take one more to finish up here.
Okay.
This looks like what is the end availability of composted manure in years 2, 3, and 4? You said it was 15% in the first year. What would it be following?
Yeah, probably 5, 6, 7% in the second year, and probably nothing left in the third year. It's pretty well, because that composting process is intended to break down organic matter. It's releasing, making that organic nitrogen plant available or into an organic form. And then if it's not being applied and used, that's going to be lost from that compost through ammonia volatilization or through leaching in that pile. So nitrogen is just not one of the best. Compost is not one of the best sources for nitrogen. It's not going to give you a whole lot the first year, and probably not very much the second year either.